Uncle Bob told me this last. It's Carol's origin story, so to speak. And no, she doesn't become Carol by falling into a vat of radioactive bitanium. Bob said Carol has always been, well, Carol. He said as a toddler, she would look around sometimes and, finding no one paying attention to her, would fall to the ground screaming. If she couldn't get a toy, she would break it. She would fly into these rages, and the only way they'd stop was if Grandpa placated her with a toy or treat. Grandma wasn't mean to Carol, but she was cool to her. Like, Carol would throw a tantrum and Grandma would just shut off and walk out of the room. I think she recognized, even back then, that there was something bad in Carol, something cruel and greedy. Carol did not improve as the other children were born. If Uncle Craig started crying and no grown-up was around, Carol, now old enough to walk, would drag him to the closet and shut him in there. Bob said Grandpa would tell that story like a funny joke, and Grandma would get thin-lipped and silent. There's a lot of things, a lot of little things Bob isn't quite sure of, like how Tim once got a bunch of ant bites in the yard that had no anthills before or since, or how toys would disappear and turn up in a cache, or never turn up at all, or the time they all got food poisoning after Carol demanded pork chops and Grandma made meatloaf instead. All things that look suspicious in hindsight, but no one could really prove at the time. But one thing he is sure of, one thing that Grandpa told him and then automatically made him swear not to tell anyone else, is this. Carol is a little under 10 at the time of the story. Grandma has become increasingly intolerant of her behavior, and Grandpa is always just trying to make peace, but as he works 9 to 5, he's not around enough to make much difference. On this fateful day, Grandpa arrives home to find Bob alone in the living room with the younger kids. Grandpa asks where his girls are. Bob points them outside. The house they live in is kind of out in the sticks. The yard is just a mown patch of scrub that transitions into trees with no clear line. Grandpa goes out to look for them. Now, there's this sawmill in the area. It's historical, meaning water-driven and rusted to shit, but it's still in semi-operation. Grandpa checks pretty much every conceivable area before he goes there, because what possible reason would the girls have to go there? Within seconds of setting foot in the mill yard, Carol skips up to her daddy. She's babbling excitedly, like a kid recounting a day at the beach, as she describes Grandma taking her up to see the logs come in, putting Carol's head on the track, and holding it there as the log comes sluicing down. Carol says Grandma pulled her back at the last second, but even so, Grandpa is disturbed. He gathers Carol up and takes her home, gives her a popsicle. Grandma comes home not long after. She's got a very wary look on her face. Grandpa decides that she's probably just tired and doesn't press her about the incident. He just vows to himself to take more care of Carol from now on. He told Bob this as if he had done Grandma a favor by not discussing her attempt on their offspring's life or getting her psychiatric help. They never spoke of the incident, not once. Bob said his dad told him that's what a man's job was, being responsible for your family by shouldering all the burden. And then I had to tell him that part of the mill wasn't accessible to the public, and if it was an operation, it sure as shit would have had loggers who would immediately call the cops over a mother trying to commit familicide. I had to tell him that there was really no way they could have stood by the sluice either, as it's an elevated track. I had to watch his face as one of the cornerstones of the foundation of his life crumbled away.
Really?
He said quietly.
Really?
Yeah. I nodded. We took a field trip there for Jill's 6th grade class, Bob said.
God damn it.
I don't know if it was just hammered into him never to question what his father said, or if he subconsciously realized Carol might be lying but chose to believe in it because he needed to justify his father's behavior. He needed there to be a reason Carol was so messed up and why they kept enabling her. I'm sorry, I said, for a lot of things. Bob looked down, so I finally told him what we'd done on the day of his wedding. He started out pretty grim, but by the end he was smiling.
Hell, kid.
He said, slapping me on the arm.
You go and do what I never had the guts to.
Well, it wasn't just me. If it had been, I don't know what I would have done, but it was my girls. Would she put them in danger? That was it. I took a sip of my beer, which had warmed up the whole time Bob was telling the story. Bob looked a bit unsteady, and not just from the 7.6% ale we'd been guzzling.
I know I let your mom down,
He said.
I let Amy down, I let Tim down, I let a lot of people down over the years. And for what?
I shrugged. You loved your dad, plain and simple. If Grandpa had been the one to die instead of your mom, we wouldn't be here. I pointed at him. And may I say, he let you down first. Bob gave me a very small smile.
You talk too much sense, kid.
He said.
Where'd you come from?
My mom had me out of pure spite, I said, which made him choke on his next sip. I slapped him on the back and finished my long neck and called it a night when Aunt Amy came home. I made a point of looking at her and raising my eyebrows, and Bob made a fine gesture with his hand. I called my wife to come get my worthless ass. She agreed to after she was caught up on Walking Dead. I pretended to be freezing to death over the phone, and she told me to stick a carrot out of my zipper so she'd know which snowman I was. God, I love that woman. I walked around a bit, just mulling over all the things Bob told me. I don't believe Grandma was ever going to kill Carol. I really think she took Carol aside to try, once and for all, to read her the riot act, and it probably went as well as any time we tried to confront Carol on her behavior. I don't know much about Grandma. Mom was really little when she died, and whenever she would try to talk about a memory, maybe Grandma in the kitchen or tucking her in at night, Carol would butt in and say something like, "Oh yeah, then you cried so loud," so that my mom basically has no recollection of her own mother, untainted by Carol's bullshit. But from what I've been able to gather, Grandma was not the type of woman to murder her own offspring, even if it was Carol. Also, Carol goes apoplectic if you throw a glass of water on her. She would not be cheerful and chatty after an attempt on her own life, so Carol lied, pretty flagrantly, and with that lie, she bought a lifetime pardon. I can't condone Grandma's alcoholism, but if I was stuck in a marriage where my spouse would believe my attention-gobbling dumpster fire of a kid over me, I'd drink too. I think I'm going to tell my mom the story Bob told me today, and Tim, and Craig, and I'll tell the wedding story too. I'll keep on talking and talking, because not talking is what got us all in this mess in the first place.